I saw Leonard Cohen singing this song last summer, and everybody knows, and it really struck quite a chord with me. The question I've been given to address, as Mike has already told you, can a business ever be truly sustainable, implies that we all know that it's not sustainable at the moment. I think everybody knows that, but unlike those in this song, there are some people who are brave enough to say so. I have absolutely no doubt that it is possible for a business to be sustainable, and the thought that it might not be is rather daunting. But getting there is not going to be a trivial issue. Business is just a tool for getting something done that we want done. If we decide that we want a business to deliver sustainable outcomes, we've got to ask for it, and we've got to design a business to deliver it. We're quite good at ensuring that we get what we want, holding suppliers to pre-agreed requirements, for instance. But we're not very good at asking for what we want, specifying it correctly. We wrote the rules, but we didn't write them for the present circumstances. Labour and technology were the limiting factors, and our appetite was but a pinprick on the side of the planet. So the ecosystem was understandably ignored. Our ability to consume has now shifted the primary constraints to natural capital and ecosystem services. And if we don't internalise this and act upon it, we have the same sort of problem as Keynote. Business is not rewarded for what society needs at the moment. This sounds harsh, because business does a great deal of good, but the unintended consequences and the externalities are overwhelming the upside. If they didn't, we wouldn't be facing this problem of unsustainability, driven by the carrying capacity of the planet and our efforts to overwhelm it. This misalignment will be a terminal barrier if we don't address it, but it's not even easy to acknowledge it. As Thomas Paine once said, a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right. We can address it in one of two ways. We can change the rules, or we can design businesses that under the current rules make more money by delivering what society needs than by delivering what society does not need. Governments of democratic societies don't really have the mandate to change the rules, but policy will enthusiastically follow good news. So businesses must show the way by example, commercially successful, sustainable business. And policy will then need no further bidding. I've become convinced, in fact, that not only is this possible, but that the greatest opportunities for significant competitive advantage in our mature economic system lie in business models expressly designed to deliver environmental, social, and financial return. And this is just another way of talking about alignment of the interests of business with the interests of society. This is system-level change rather than optimization, a step change the likes of which we haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution. We have to understand both our interaction with the planet and how we organize ourselves at a system level. We have to design our way out of this thoughtfully, rather than blundering along trying to tweak all the things we've become so good at doing. As Peter Drucker once said, nothing is less productive than to make more efficient what should not be done at all. To introduce myself, I work for Riversimple, and for some years we've been developing technology for sustainable cars. Our purpose statement here is to systematically pursue the elimination of the environmental damage caused by personal transport. Elimination is quite a big goal, and we're not going to get there overnight, which is why systematically is such an important word. But if that isn't our goal, we certainly aren't going to get there. And being less unsustainable is never going to be sustainable. More importantly, we've been working on the strategies and models for bringing such technology to market. I say more importantly because I don't believe that the principal barriers are technical. They're to do with people, politics, and business inertia. So most of my work is on the strategies needed for the step change that we face. In a step change, there is no incremental path. And although specialism has achieved remarkable things over the last 200 years, I'm quite sure that the breakthroughs that we need now are to be found at the system level. First, I would like to put this system level change into context. In developing Riversimple, we've placed great faith in learning from natural ecosystems. So before I get stuck into any specific observations, I'd like to explain my interpretation of the pickle that we're now in, using the natural world as an analogy. Evolution is not a continuous process. It goes in fits and starts. When conditions are stable within fairly narrow boundaries, the existing population optimizes and diversifies to fill niches. Right. The species become highly specific to the habitats that they enjoy and the conditions of the habitats. However, when there's a substantive change, through some geological event or a climate tipping point, there's a period of chaos, and a new and very different order emerges from rather surprising roots, not an adaptation of the previous order, and then the cycle is repeated. What's evident is that the specialization that is such a strength in periods of stability is a catastrophic weakness when faced with a step change in conditions. The strategies needed for dealing with step changes are very different to those that triumph in periods of optimization. You can't cross a chasm in 2 leaps. Now, I'd like to compare this with the progress of human society, and you may already be doing so. My contention is that we're here. The conditions have changed qualitatively. However, we've settled into assumptions that the strategy of optimization that's been so successful for the last 200 years is the answer. Not surprisingly, if that is where we are culturally, the mindset of our political, industrial systems sits there as well. And that drives resource allocation in the economic sense, focusing society's resources on an incremental path. My contention is that this can lead to no happy outcome. So it's incumbent upon business to find new ways of making more money. This diagram shows a converging funnel of constraints that is facing every company in every country, principally composed of resource depletion and regulatory pressures. Business has really been forged by the constraints of the 20th century. And as the constraints of the 21st century were simply not on the radar, it's not surprising that we're constantly hitting the walls of this funnel, which is very painful and very expensive. It is actually inevitable because the profit motive lies far outside the funnel. So adapting to these constraints increases costs and reduces profitability. Now, we can't predict timescales. My favourite joke is, how do you make God laugh? You tell him your plans. But trends in conditions and constraints can be observed with near certainty. At Riversimple, we're designing our business to profit from being in the mainstream, in the centre of this stream, so that staying within the funnel becomes a source of competitive advantage rather than the cost on the bottom line. Business has always had to be sustainable, in fact, but only within very limited terms of reference, financial. And this simply means a balance sheet that increases rather than decreases. Not applying that concept more widely as other factors become apparent, betting against this converging funnel would seem foolhardy. Other balance sheets than money are as critical, perhaps more critical, and they're declining. As Paul Hawken is fond of saying, capitalism is a jolly good system. We should try it sometime. So, for sustainable practices to take hold, we must devise ways to be more profitable by doing so. This has always been the surest way to get people to copy, to stimulate change. As Buckminster Fuller said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. To me, this is a design problem. And it's quite the biggest design problem that I know of today. Designers increasingly talk about 3 levels of design. D1 is design at the level of products and services, as refined by the Bauhaus. D2 is design at the level of systems, which is luckily becoming ever more common today. And D3 is the design at the level of purpose, ideology, or framing. These are all reflected in the work of Joanna Macy, who's one of the world's leading sustainability educators, who talks about 3 levels of change. First is specific actions to slow down environmental damage. Second are structural changes. And third, a shift in consciousness. In fact, even the US, Israeli, and Australian military have developed a theory of systemic design, and they talk about 3 levels of design: methods, methodology, and mindset. I think that is very telling. Not only do we have to develop new technologies and new business models, but we also have to internalize an entirely new frame of reference. We need to do so not only to nurture new models, but to even be able to conceive of the solutions at the lower levels that we need. And this is why corporate governance is so important. This is also what made me truly comprehend the depth of Einstein's assertion when he said that no problem can be solved from the same consciousness that created it. To achieve real alignment with the interests of society, to design to deliver environmental and social return as well as financial, needs fiduciary responsibility to all these interests to be balanced. But the upside is to move from the world of social enterprise, where environmental and social return are an explicit objective, but a compromise in financial return is accepted, to a model in which environmental and social return enhance the financial return. Now, I acknowledge that this is all easier said than done. I also acknowledge that it's easier to design from a clean sheet of paper than to tweak a company that's designed to do something fundamentally different. It's historically much easier to change technologies than business models. It is a very rich subject, and solutions will require some deep thinking, but I'm very interested in a few principles and strategies worthy of consideration because together they provide a framework for thinking differently and lead to profoundly different outcomes. I don't want to suggest that what I have to say constitutes a comprehensive recipe for a sustainable business. There are gaps in all our understanding, but this is unknown territory, so by definition there are some unknowns. If there's one unifying theme, it's about aligning the interests of all actors in the complex system that is industry, commerce, society, and the planet. A good first example is what is known in academic circles as product-service systems, the sale of service rather than product. Sale of service is discussed quite widely today, but I don't believe it's generally understood just how profound an impact it has. At Riversimple, rather than selling a car as a product, we will sell mobility as a service, providing a car under a performance contract, including not only maintenance, but also insurance and fuel. When the contract expires, the car returns to Riversimple and is provided to a second and ultimately to a third, fourth, fifth owner. This all sounds very simple, and it bears a superficial resemblance to the way in which cars are currently leased, although it has both the opposite motive and the opposite effect. If we sell cars, we make more money by selling more cars. We're directly rewarded for obsolescence and high running costs, the opposite of what our customer wants. Instead, Riversimple is rewarded for longevity and low running costs, aligning the formerly polarized interests of the manufacturer and the customer. Why does this help create a sustainable system? It doesn't just ease the problem, it completely reverses all the financial drivers. Instead of being rewarded for maximizing resource consumption, resource throughput, the manufacturer is rewarded for resource efficiency, meeting the need with the minimum possible resource consumption. Specifically, the manufacturer pays for fuel for the entire life of the vehicle. So if you can make it more efficient, he will make more money. The longer the revenue stream that he can extract from each car, the longer he can amortize the asset over. In environmental terms, this is an extraordinary opportunity. Usually any strategy that delivers reduced environmental impact is an additional cost on the bottom line. So no one can afford to do it until there's a government mandate and a level playing field. But in this case, it's a source of competitive advantage, and so it can be pursued unilaterally. However, for this system to work and deliver the outcomes I'm suggesting, it's essential to keep it on the asset on one balance sheet, from the clean sheet of paper for the design of car, right through the service life to the end-of-life disposal. This makes it possible to draw an envelope right around the total life cycle costs, rather than leaving operational and disposal costs to the end user, and making a purely rational economic decision on the cheapest way to deliver that service. Classically, perfect information will allow customers to make rational economic decisions too. But they will always discount these future costs so heavily that it will never be in the interest of manufacturers to take any significant account of those costs. The total cost of ownership can only be significantly more expensive in a sale of product model than it would be if a rational economic decision could have been made in a single entity. We're also working with our suppliers on this model upstream into the supply chain, aligning the interests of manufacturers with suppliers as well. For instance, instead of buying fuel cells, we're developing contracts under which we pay for installed kilowatt hours in our cars. We then have a shared interest, not only in the longevity of the fuel cell, but also in the cheapest way to deliver that service of that product, to the extent that an open book policy could be maintained, a much healthier basis for a truly collaborative working relationship. If this principle is driven right the way through to the clean sheet of paper for the vehicle design, it will transform not just the way the business behaves, but also the design, the specification, and the performance of the car that emerges for the better. Whether at the stage of design, manufacturing, or operation, the company has a direct and continuing interest in efficiency, longevity, and reliability. It changes the design criteria. Every decision about investing increased efficiency, life, or reliability. It changes the drivers for managing production. Every micro decision about quality control. It creates a direct interest in design for maximum recovery of value at end of life. He who designs it will own it at the end of life, and the value of the car is much greater to the manufacturer than anyone else. So you'd better design it to extract as much value as you can. Selling service also lowers the barriers to bringing new low-carbon vehicle technologies to market. This slide shows a typical cost curve when bringing a new technology to volume production. If selling low-carbon cars, supply chain costs must match the extraordinarily low costs enjoyed by the industry for combustion engine technology at the moment. This is a chicken and egg problem because low cost requires volume, but building volume requires low costs. However, if we sell mobility rather than cars, we capture 100% of the economic benefit of increased efficiency. This in turn means that we can introduce relatively immature technologies at an equivalent cost of ownership to the customer long before supply chain costs match those of the existing technology. The sale of service also aligns the interests of manufacturers with the stretch targets of regulators. It can achieve far more quickly and far more cheaply than any amount of mandates and fuel economy mandates and emissions thresholds. Mandates only provide an incentive to get below the threshold and no more. But they can never provide any incentive to excel on any of those criteria because it all eats into margin. It is far better and necessary to give a positive incentive to systematically reach for zero. This also brings up the issue of competition, on which we place so much reliance. It's important to note that competition provides an incentive to be a little bit better than your competitors, but again, no incentive whatever to excel on any of those metrics. Selling service rather than product is a very good example of what for us is a key design principle, self-regulation. And I do not mean self-regulation as discussed in and practiced by the media, but self-regulation in scientific terms, feedback loops that automatically correct any variance from the desired behaviour. Behaviours and outcomes are intrinsic. They are hardwired into the system. This is the central characteristic of an adaptive complex system. I want to contrast this with active regulation, regulation that is not inherent in the design of the system. And it requires both rules and a police force to enforce those rules. This is our default mode of operating both with people and with organisations as a damage limitation exercise. Self-regulation is more efficient and more effective than active regulation. It's more efficient because it's free. You don't have to pay for the police force. And it's also more effective because no policing system can ever be 100% effective. Self-regulation, on the other hand, removes the very incentive to cheat, to do anything other than what optimises the system. The lessons of complexity science are very clearly that we should prioritise redesigning our systems like this, so that they reward the behaviour that we want before mopping up any loose ends with regulation, if we ever want to develop a sustainable industrial system. Unfortunately, we don't like bad news, we don't like writing off sunk investments, and we don't like change. And this reminds me of one of the best things I got out of 15 years in motorsport, the dictum that there's never enough time to do the job properly, but there's always enough time to do it twice. And sadly, the evidence of this temptation is all around us today. I mentioned that it's critical to keep a product on the balance sheet of he who designs it, right through to end-of-life disposal. The reason is that otherwise the feedback loops I'm talking about would be broken. In fact, even if a company decides to treat manufacturing and fleet operations as two separate profit centres, these loops are still broken. A transfer price is required between these two entities, and even though this transfer price is equal and opposite, it will completely change the drivers of the manufacturing profit centre. It is back in the business of selling cars, because that's how it's assessed. By splitting into two entities, the aggregated outcome from the whole system will be both qualitatively and quantitatively quite different. All of these factors add up to what you might call top-line approaches to solving our problems, as opposed to bottom line. The triple bottom line, whilst a very good thing, audits financial, environmental and social return. But companies are conventionally only designed to deliver the financial return. The other two are a cost. Regulation places limits on the negative externalities on those other two dimensions. And so they need to be counted in order to manage these externalities to meet requirements at minimal possible cost. However, if we design the self-regulating feedback loops that I've been explaining, systematic reduction of those impacts becomes intrinsic to the system, whether or not they're actually counted. We also need to think in terms of systems or networks rather than hierarchies, and self-regulation is the medium of control in systems design. Control is an interesting question. It has two quite distinct meanings in English. In colloquial terms, or in the financial world, it is understood as the power and the right to choose what to do, to dictate, much as a general commands. Whereas control in engineering or cybernetic terms is all about feedback loops that tweak the system to optimize it. Course corrections to respond to disturbances from changing external conditions. Self-regulation, in fact. The idea that this can deliver a more resilient and a profitable business may seem unnerving, but we can take encouragement again from the ecosystem, which is the only complex system that we know of that actually works. To survive for 3.5 billion years, it's clearly got something right, but nobody is controlling it, and it is driven entirely by self-interest. So we needn't be off-put by those who say that we've forgotten that people are fundamentally selfish. I picked up a hitchhiker recently who was convinced that we're all fundamentally bad, the concept of original sin. and we need authoritarian control in order for society to work. He didn't actually believe in evolution, and he pointed out that foxes will run amok in a chicken pen and kill for the sake of it without being able remotely to eat them all. But of course, before we came along, chicken pens were uncommon, to say the least. So it's not a scenario which the ecosystem has evolved to deal with. But with our rather perverse and selective criteria for accounting for the costs and benefits in society, we've been creating chicken pens that are breeding grounds for destructive behaviour, without a complementary set of rules that builds these chicken pens into a coherent and functional system. Moving back from the control of systems to the systems themselves, the sale of service is necessary, but despite all I've said about it, it is not sufficient. We also need to give up our linear systems. Some regard waste as the most profound invention of mankind, because there's no such thing in the ecosystem, and transition entirely to cyclical systems. These can include both biological and technical nutrient cycles. The concept of the closed loop, or circular economy, has been around for a while, but it's received an enormous boost in recent years, both in policy circles and more widely due to the great work the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have been doing, along with this very centre, in fact. We could glibly say that we need to live off revenue, but that's not entirely true. Again, we can think of money. We live off income rather than capital, but we do leverage capital. We use it as a means to an end, but we don't lose that capital, or at least we hope not to lose it. Anything consumable, such as energy or biological nutrients, has to come from revenue sources. But technical nutrients can come from capital resources, as long as the loops are completely closed, 100% recycling as opposed to downcycling. This is utilising rather than consuming a capital resource. It stays on the balance sheet. And we need to leverage such capital resources rather than treat them as consumables. Oil is the best example, obviously, and many are lamenting our one-off bonanza of burning millions of years worth of capital that could instead be used as a capital asset in a circular economy. Finally, I'd like to tie this together with the concept of whole system design. Whole system design suggests that if we optimize subsystems, we deliver a pessimised whole system. Instead, design choices must be made at the whole system level. Alternative subsystems can only be compared by looking at their impact on the performance of the whole system, usually by building a model and plugging the alternatives into that model. It often leads in a car, for instance, to choosing a component that is heavier, more expensive or less efficient, because it delivers a car that is lighter, cheaper, or more efficient. This is rather counterintuitive in our reductionist Newtonian worldview, but we need to start realizing how the emergent properties of complex systems fundamentally challenge the supremacy of analytical thinking. Referring back to the three levels of design, products or services, the systems that deliver them, and the purpose or mindset that creates the vision, we need to work on these three levels simultaneously. At Riversimple, we've been applying whole system design not only to the car, but also to the business models, level 2, and also the corporate governance, level 3. There are also whole system design effects between these levels. An investor in Riversimple last year said to me that he thinks this is the first time that a car has been developed for a business model. Taking the concept of the network further and optimization of the whole system, I also suggest that we need to think more at the level of the ecosystem within which we operate, rather than draw a boundary around our own company. This is not altruistic. Society, or the economy, is a subset of the natural ecosystem, and it is entirely sensible for all the most selfish reasons to invest in preserving that ecosystem. The same applies to companies in their business ecosystems. A resilient ecosystem is a much safer place to be. So we need to think more about optimizing our business ecosystems rather than just our companies. To do this, we need to genuinely work together. This is not just a bit of partnering, but designing our ecosystems such that our interests are sufficiently aligned that we can solve problems on an open book basis. because without that open book, neither party has the information, sufficient information to make optimal decisions. For instance, all too often in consultancy circles, manufacturing is characterized as old-fashioned. Investment often demands that we should streamline business by outsourcing the difficult things like this, the capital requirements and the risk. But outsourcing only shuffles risk to somewhere else in the ecosystem. It hasn't changed anything. It usually weakens rather than optimizes the whole, and I'm sure that it will increasingly be seen as old-fashioned thinking as well. Resilience is much more important, after all, than profit, even for investors. You can't have a resilient business without profit anyway, but you can all too easily have a profitable business that isn't resilient. Now, I'm sure that not only can a business be truly sustainable, but it is actually the key to our sustainable future. However, the steps we are taking currently are not going to get us there. I don't believe that we can ever create a sustainable industrial society while we continue to reward industry for the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. Industry is very powerful. Whether a power for good or a power for bad, I believe, is up to us. As Buckminster Fuller also said, we are called to be architects of the future, not its victims. Thank you.